The Songwriter, Chapter 2, The Transformation. It was May 1972 when I started my first job in Australia as an apprentice French polisher and spray painter. I worked in a factory with Australians at RMS Kingfisher, a shop fitter in Auburn. Nobody could understand a word I said for 6 months, and I had difficulty understanding the Australian slang. But I enjoyed my work and got on very well with the tradesmen. One day in the factory, a practical joker threw a tin of thinners over me, and as a solvent, it soaked in through my work clothes and my skin was starting to burn. So I went into the locker room to change, and somebody struck a match and suddenly I was burst into flames. I managed to pull off my shirt because of my working boots. I couldn't get off my Wrangler jeans in a hurry. I ran out from the locker room to the factory screaming as the flames leapt from both my legs. Somebody lifted a hot water urn that was on for morning tea near the locker room and threw it all over my legs. In shock, I was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital in Auburn, treated for third-degree burns for both legs. I was laid up in bed for 6 months, unable to walk, and receiving workers' compensation each week. I lay there in bed with a steel cage over my legs, which prevented the blankets from touching my very tender legs. My thoughts were all of my friends in Belfast I had left behind. My bedroom was prison, and I was tortured every day by a great homesickness. I waited for the letters to come each week from Belfast. Each letter that came was filled with sorrow and the news of friends who had either been shot dead, arrested or interned. Suddenly we met another family from Belfast who had arrived at Villawood Hostel. The Liddy family came from the Bone, which was very close to our down. Finally we had made a bond with someone. Mum began to miss home. She often cried. The time passed slowly, and my legs improved. Skin grafts were needed. I had regular visits from the local doctor, who changed the bandages and painted the wounds with red dye. My meals were brought from the canteen at the hostel. Mum and Dad had both started work, and soon after did two of my sisters, Geraldine and Marion. My two youngest sisters, Terry and Sarah, started school at Our Lady of the Rosary in Fairfield. We began to settle down into a new way of life. It was soon time for us to leave Villawood Hostel, and we took up residence in our first rental accommodation in Australia. We moved into a 3-bedroom house in Orchardley Street at Guildford. After almost a year, I was able to get up and walk again and return to work in the factory. I tried hard to adopt a new lifestyle, but at 16 I felt it was too late to change and too soon to adapt, and in the end it was nearly impossible. For a number of years I couldn't settle. I missed my friends, and I found it very hard to forget Belfast. I had a negative outlook on things that came through in my poetry, which had become cold and critical. I destroyed much of what I wrote. I was unhappy with my writing and burnt hundreds of poems in the incinerator out the back garden. I finished my apprenticeship with RMS Kingfisher and started another apprenticeship as a motor mechanic with Volvo. I still felt uneasy about things and couldn't settle at all. Everything took its toll, and I had a nervous breakdown about the end of 1975. At the 20 years of age, I was lost, confused, returned to Belfast, and in 76, shortly after arriving home, I was taken in an ambulance to Portisburn Psychiatric Hospital. I was given electric shock treatment, or they called it ECT, then sedated very heavily for 6 months. After a year, I returned back to Australia. My family never knew me. My appearance had changed. I'd put on weight, lost some hair. I'd become withdrawn, extremely sensitive about things. I found writing poetry a great therapy, and after a few years, something began to happen inside me. I realised how I had to make it work in Australia. So I forced my way into factories and started to change my perspective. I started to make friends, which brought me out of my closet where my poetry and I had locked out life. I brought a collection of poems to my parents, expected them to laugh at them and make jokes about my writing, but to my surprise, they never did. I was encouraged by Dad, and he sat down and read my work. That moment was very special for me. I watched Dad as he went through my writing. He seemed proud of my work. and told Mum I had something. I was delighted to hear him say that. For so long I had kept secret this part of my life, and now there stood the poet before them. That evening he gave me a heart-to-heart talk about life and my writing. He brought them together as one. Dad asked me to write a book on my experiences with my nervous breakdown and the recovery. I had never gave any thought about this topic before, and it seemed more than a challenge. I started to write poems that cut open a wide and vivid image of an unbalanced mind. The picture was disturbing, and I burnt 250 of these poems. After I destroyed the work, I felt as if a great load had been lifted from my shoulders. Maybe that was Dad's blessing and what he had meant for me. Soon afterwards, Dad and I became close. Sometimes we'd go for a drink at the pub at Greystanes or go over to the Wentworth Leagues Club. We started jogging together every day, and Dad and I would sometimes have a swim in the Parramatta pool. I had a new mate, and we went everywhere together. I enjoyed his company and went along with him to the Rosehill racetrack and Harle Park trots. He made me feel okay about my writing, and that was the answer that I needed to hear. As a poet, the only expense I had ever gone to was with poetry, and it occurred to me that I could go maybe use a little bit more inspiration, go a bit further and write a song. I could even play a few chords. I loved the music. I know the poet then became the songwriter. The musician in me had become a self-conscious person of the level of skill that I had. I took on guitar lessons with a man called Fred, who had placed an advertisement in the newspaper. Every Friday I went over to his flat in Auburn for an hour and discovered new things like bar chords and tempo. I practiced at home between lessons and discovered a new style, a direction of my own. It was an early learning experience with the guitar, and one that I enjoyed. After about 6 months, Fred was moving away from Auburn, and he told me he could not teach me anymore. It was then I asked Fred for his help to buy a new guitar. Early one Saturday morning, Fred and I went into Sydney City. We parked the car in Eddy Avenue, and he knew the exact shop to go to. I picked myself a Navarra electric 6-string guitar, a small amplifier, and I went off to show that new instrument to my mum and dad. And everyone was all over them. My sisters wanted me to play them a song, and for the first time I felt as if a little stardom had started to shine around me. I was on my second guitar now, a Fender acoustic that I found my way with music. I had plenty to say, and sometimes there wasn't enough time in a day to write down the thoughts that drifted through my mind. Although my experience as a poet and a songwriter was very lonely, I was happy enough to exist there with my writing. Since arriving in Australia, my writing ability had grown up through blue periods and a mixed set of circumstances. Over the years, I had gone through different jobs: a storeman, factory worker, driveway attendant, console operator, and my trade as a French polisher and spray painter. I was quite often inspired during my work hours, so I had a notepad and pen always with me. People who would see me scribbling down things or maybe recording something on a little cassette deck that I had were always curious and always asking me what I was doing. And when I showed them, I was given great encouragement to give my writing more time. One evening at Greystanes, I went for a get-together over a cup of tea with the community hall and the people from the Catholic Church. An Irish nun who was there was talking with some of the community, and she came over and said hello. Sister Honora was an elderly lady, and she told me that her time was teaching, but it had nearly finished. When I told her I was a writer, she asked if I would let her read some of my work. I felt honoured that somebody was interested in my poetry, and so the next day I brought her a number of my poems. After reading them, Sister Honora encouraged me to show my poetry around. I thought about what she had said and decided to give it a go. I rang some Sydney radio stations and started to read my poetry on the air. I contacted the New South Wales Writers' Centre at Rozelle, the Poets' Union, the Australian Society of Authors, some magazines and newspapers. And I sent letters with my poetry to some of the contacts that I had been given. Radio seemed to provide an excellent vehicle for my poetry. I had now a long list of specialised programmes that specifically dealt with poetry. One of the better shows was on 3LO in Melbourne with John Reid on his weekend lifestyle programme. It was on the ABC National Radio. I had also a set of places I could go to where poets could read their work to live audiences, so I began to read my poetry around on a regular weekly basis. The number of venues kept me busy as a performing poet, and I was glad to hear applause after my work was read. And apart from poets in the audience, there was a mixed assortment of people from the audience, academic side of life, and radio presenters, and there were tourists and journalists. Once your face is known, it was easy to talk to these people in the audience. There was a friendly atmosphere, and often to meet up with the same people at different gigs. At some of the Sydney gigs like the Annandale Cafe, the Dawn Banks Museum, the Writers' Centre, I brought along a Fender guitar and tried out some of my new songs, and I was asked to appear then on Australian-made poetry a few times as the guest of Dulcie Meadows on 2NBC. A kind of domino effect developed with each new piece that I wrote and each new contact that I made, and I discovered new venues for poetry reading and other radio stations who also put poetry to air. Southern FM Victoria began to broadcast my work. Catherine Anderson on 2BLU invited me to read on her Poetry Plus programme in the Blue Mountains. There was also spots at the National Folk Festivals where poets were welcome to read poetry in the marquees and the wine bars. It was a great step, and I had made efforts to show my work around, but in doing all this travelling there was not much spare time to allow the creative juices to flow. I still had so much to write about, and in 1983 I made the decision to set aside more time to work and put more effort into songwriting. I explained to Mum and Dad that I needed some time on my own and that I had decided to leave home and move into a place of my own. I found a little place in Pendle Hill where I spent most of every hour of every day writing. This went on for months, and my room was littered with scraps of paper. I knew that the Spirit of God was with me because I was inspired, and after 6 months I had quite a large collection of original works. I had no wage on which to live, and times were tough. I sold my car and my electric guitar. I was now just surviving on paying rent and the usual grocery bills. I also went busking when times were very lean, and when those times were even leaner still I had to borrow money. Being poor meant that I had to struggle more and more and go without most of the time. Sometimes I had to get away from Pendle Hill. I loved to take weekend trips to Coffs Harbour. It was a great spot for me to busk my songs, and with the money that people give, I would either eat well or go hungry and book in to the Backpackers Youth Hostel. Or if people were generous, I would stay at one of the better hotels. From Coffs Harbour to Sawtell, from Newcastle to Canberra, I brought my songs, my music, and sometimes I would meet other buskers who played along with me. I had abandoned myself in the world with my songs and never knew where I would go next. Busking provided an excellent venue to get some feedback from an audience. I loved the overnight train trips back to Sydney. There was always a friendly atmosphere on the train, and the passengers enjoyed me playing them a few tunes on the way. Each time I arrived back home in Sydney, I went busking again in George Street, Pitt Street, in the heart of Sydney, where a steady flow of people often passed by. Another favourite place I liked to go busking was down the ramp by Parramatta railway station. Each time I returned home to Pendle Hill, I was isolated again, and it hit me how much I needed the space as a songwriter. I was happy there, alone in my little place, with no human being to talk to or influence me, remote and hidden away from the world in a contemplative lifestyle with nothing but a little light for company. I had no TV or radio because I felt that my control over what I was thinking or writing. All my melodies were my very own, always, as were my lyrics. It was important for me to be an original songwriter in every aspect of the word. My life revolved around poetic thinking. I walked with it, I talked with it, I breathed it, I smelt it on my clothes. Everywhere I went, I carried a notebook, a pen, and I was carried away by inspirations and recorded everything that came into my head. I had a portable cassette that I kept with me often. My collection of short stories and plays and poetry and songs were now growing. I was writing from experience, and for me that was the most powerful form of expression. I travelled around the country and met people in their hometowns. Before I sold my car, I had also had 3 cars that were stolen, and I was unhappy about that. But I did enjoy travelling around the country, capturing all the beautiful landscapes. I had driven to South Australia. I had driven to northern Queensland. All of these visits inspired little images of the people and places where I went. 2 of my cars were not insured. The third one was covered for market value, which was half the price I paid for it. I often thought that the world would be a better place without the motor car. I suppose there's a space for the dreamer like me, and it never ceases to wonder, sometimes, at life. The end of chapter 2.